There is a number I want you to hold before we go any further. 26. That is how many earthen mounds were recorded along the St. Louis riverfront in 1819, surveyed, mapped, described in writing by people who understood they were looking at something that did not fit the story they had already decided to tell. 26 structures, some of them 60 feet tall, some spanning the footprint of a city block, built with an internal engineering precision that 19th century observers found remarkable, and then, remarkably, set aside. Today, where they stood, there is a steel arch, federally funded, internationally photographed, and I kept asking myself the same question. What, exactly, were we expanding into? Let me start with what the official record does tell us, because it tells us more than most people realize, and that is precisely where the problem begins. The Gateway Arch was completed in 1965. It stands 630 feet tall. It sits within the Jefferson National Expansion Memorial, a federal park established in 1935, dedicated to Thomas Jefferson's vision of westward expansion and the Louisiana Purchase. The story is clean, the symbolism is legible. A nation looks west, builds an arch, frames the horizon. You have seen the photographs, you have probably stood beneath it, and the official account is not false. That is important to say clearly before we go further. The official account is not false. It is incomplete in a very specific way, and the specific way matters. What the photographs don't show is what was cleared to build it. Before the federal government acquired and demolished the riverfront district in the late 1930s and early 1940s, and before the neighborhood, and before the industrial warehouses that preceded it, there were mounds, not metaphorically, not archaeologically speculative, physically present, historically documented, named. The complex had a name, Mound City. 26 earthen structures along the western bank of the Mississippi, some of them over 60 feet tall, all of them engineered, all of them described in detail by observers who understood, at least partially, what they were looking at. Henry Marie Brackenridge was not a fringe figure. He was a lawyer, a writer, an explorer of credible reputation, and in 1811 he walked the St. Louis riverfront and wrote down what he saw. His account is specific. He described the mounds as remnants of a population so large, so organized, so structurally sophisticated that he believed they deserved to rank alongside the great ancient societies of the world. Not as curiosities, not as primitive earthworks, as civilization. He sent a letter directly to Thomas Jefferson, the known archaeology enthusiast, the man with the institutional standing to do something about it. The letter exists. Jefferson received it. Nothing happened. The response does not exist. Not refuted, not investigated, not even formally acknowledged and set aside for later. Quiet. I want to sit with that texture for a moment, because I think it's easy to read past. A documented letter, a credible observer, one of the most intellectually curious men in American political history as its recipient, a pre-Columbian urban complex of potentially world historical significance as its subject, and the record simply goes quiet. That is not absence of evidence. That is a shape, and shapes, once you learn to see them, do not stop being visible. The mounds themselves were not obscure. They appear on early maps of St. Louis. Maximilian Braun's 1764 survey captures the riverfront profile with structures that are unmistakably artificial in their regularity. Later surveys confirm them. Travellers describe them. Artists sketch them. The record of their existence is not thin. It is surprisingly rich for a civilization that the official history of North America treats as peripheral. And then, across the 19th century, the documentation shifts. Not from observation to investigation, not from description to excavation, from observation to subtraction. The mounds begin disappearing from the maps not because they were understood, but because they were demolished. The fill went into roads, into levees, into foundations. The largest pre-Columbian urban complex north of Mexico, a civilization whose peak population estimates range from 10,000 to 20,000 people in the central precinct alone, numbers that would have made it larger than contemporary London, was quarried for gravel. I am not presenting that as conspiracy. I want to be precise about what I am presenting it as. The 19th century had a specific and well-documented relationship with the mounds of the Mississippi Valley. They were obstacles, They were in the way of farms, of roads, of the infrastructure of a nation that had decided at an institutional level that what came before European contact did not qualify as civilization in any sense that required preservation. That decision made demolition easy. It made documentation unnecessary. It made Brackenridge's letter the kind of thing that could simply go unanswered. But here is where casual incuriosity stops being a sufficient explanation. The Jefferson National Expansion Memorial was not established at a random moment. 1935, federal money was moving, the New Deal was reshaping American civic infrastructure, and the specific site selected, not adjacent to the Mound complex, not nearby, but directly on top of the last surviving remnants, required a targeted acquisition and clearance process that concluded in the early 1940s. The final mounds were gone before construction began. No overlap. No awkward coexistence. No interpretive signage explaining what had been removed to make way for the arch. The site was cleared, levelled, and then commemorated. The official explanation involves the historic character of the old St. Louis waterfront and its symbolic relationship to the Louisiana Purchase. That explanation is not false, but it accounts for the location without accounting for what the location contained. And that gap, between what the site was chosen for and what the site held, is the gap I keep returning to. Because this is not the only time it happens, not X, not a regional accident, not an isolated case of careless development. It is a pattern, and patterns, once you learn to recognize them, do not stop being visible. If this series has been worth your time, consider subscribing or becoming a member. What comes next is where the pattern develops a shape I was not prepared for. The mounds were not scattered randomly across the landscape. That is the part that the standard archaeological account acknowledges and then consistently fails to pursue to its logical conclusion. The Cahokia complex, of which the St. Louis Mound Group was almost certainly a satellite separated from the main site by only a few miles of river, was organized. The alignments are cardinal. Monk's Mound, the central structure, is oriented to within fractions of a degree of true north. The causeways connecting mound groups follow geometric relationships that imply planning at a scale the accepted population and technological baseline for Mississippian civilization does not comfortably explain. You do not accidentally build a structure with a base larger than the Great Pyramid of Giza. You do not accidentally align it. You survey, you calculate, you coordinate labor across a settlement whose organizational complexity the word village does not begin to capture. And yet village is functionally the register in which Mississippian civilization tends to appear in American educational curricula, when it appears at all. I want to give that a name because naming it makes it easier to track. Call it the replacement logic. Not simply demolition. Demolition happens everywhere. Old things get cleared, new things get built. The replacement logic is something more specific. It is the act of installing a new civic symbol, a new official memory in the precise location where a prior civilization's evidence was most concentrated. Not adjacent, not nearby, on top, so that the new meaning occupies the old ground completely, and the question of what was there before becomes, architecturally, physically, literally, harder to ask. The gateway arch does not acknowledge the mounds, not in its interpretive materials, not in its founding documents, not in the name of the park that contains it. Jefferson National Expansion Memorial tells you exactly whose story this site is for. Now, I want to talk about what the mounds actually were, structurally, physically, because I think the word mound does a lot of quiet damage to our ability to understand what we are looking at. The word implies something natural, something accumulated, dirt, piled up, over time, by hands that did not quite know what they were doing. It does not prepare you for what the archaeological record actually describes. It does not prepare you for Monk's Mound. Monk's Mound covers 14 acres at its base. 14 acres. It rises in 4 terraces to a height of 100 feet. Its construction required the movement of an estimated 55 million cubic feet of earth, carried in baskets, deposited in precisely engineered layers of different soil compositions, different densities, different drainage properties, designed to prevent slumping and maintain structural integrity across centuries. That last detail is not incidental. The builders were not piling dirt. They were doing geotechnical engineering. They understood load distribution. They understood drainage. They understood compaction. The internal stratigraphy of Monk's Mound is not random. It is designed. And the people who designed it do not have a name in the official record that most Americans have ever heard. The St. Louis complex was not Cahokia, but it was not separate from Cahokia either, not independent, not isolated. The two sites are divided by the Mississippi River and a few miles of ground. The mound alignments share geometric relationships. The ceramic traditions are continuous. What Brackenridge was documenting on the St. Louis riverfront in 1811 was, in all likelihood, part of a single extended urban system, a civilization whose metropolitan footprint covered both banks of the upper Mississippi, whose organizational reach extended hundreds of miles in every direction, and whose complexity we are only beginning to take seriously in the specific academic corners where it is taken seriously at all. The population problem is where the official account becomes hardest to hold. Estimates for Cahokia at its peak, roughly 1,000 to 1,200 CE, range from 10,000 to 20,000 people within the central precinct, with a broader regional population that some researchers place considerably higher. These are not fringe numbers. They appear in peer-reviewed archaeology. They represent the conservative end of the serious scholarly range, and they mean that Cahokia, at its height, was larger than contemporary London, larger than any city in North America until Philadelphia surpassed it in the 18th century. A city that size does not emerge from scattered bands. It requires agriculture organized at scale. It requires trade networks spanning hundreds of miles. It requires governance structures capable of coordinating labor across a population that dwarfs most medieval European cities. It requires, in short, a civilization. And yet the word civilization does not attach to Cahokia the way it attaches to Rome, or Egypt, or Mesopotamia. It remains in the popular imagination an anomaly, a surprisingly large village. The replacement logic does not operate only on the ground, it operates in the curriculum. Now I want to connect this to the broader framework carefully, because the careful version is more unsettling than the careless one. Across this series we have documented a pattern, buildings that appear in the 19th century record fully formed without adequate construction documentation, infrastructure in supposedly frontier cities that would have required decades and resources those settlements did not have, civic architecture that presupposes a prior civilization's foundations. The transition periods are missing, the workforce is unaccounted for, the timelines do not work. We have called that pattern the architecture problem, and in every case the official explanation involves either dismissal or a kind of institutional hand-waving that dissolves on contact with the specific evidence. Cahokia is the architecture problem applied to earthworks. The scale of Monk's Mound, the engineering of its internal stratigraphy, the geometric precision of the broader complex, these are not adequately explained by the population and technological baseline the official timeline assigns to Mississippian civilization at 1000 CE, not X, not lucky accumulation, not primitive intuition producing accidentally precise results. What they are explained by, or at least made more legible by, is a different question entirely. What if the baseline is wrong? What if the civilization we are dating to 1000 CE was inheriting something older? What if the mound builders were not the beginning of the story, but a later chapter, building on foundations literally whose origins they may not have fully understood themselves? I am presenting that as a question, not a conclusion. But the shape of the question fits the shape of the evidence in a way I cannot stop thinking about. The same cartographic tradition that preserved ice-free maps of Antarctica, the same chain of inherited knowledge that an Ottoman admiral acknowledged when he stated his charts came from older sources he could not name, didn't operate in a vacuum bounded by the Mediterranean. It operated everywhere that knowledge was worth preserving, everywhere that someone understood, before the catastrophe came, that what they knew had to survive it. The Mississippi Valley, with its engineered earthworks and its urban scale and its systematic exclusion from the Western historical record, is as much a part of that question as any archive in Istanbul. The custodian problem does not stop at the ocean. It never did. What was under those mounds? Not metaphorically, physically. The excavations conducted at Cahokia have found elite burials, large-scale ceremonial deposits, post-mold patterns of wooden structures whose forms we can partially reconstruct. What has not been found, or more precisely, what has not been systematically sought with the full weight of 21st century ground-penetrating technology applied without institutional hesitation, is whatever lies beneath the earliest construction phases, because mounds in the Mississippian tradition were frequently built over earlier structures. They were not raised on empty ground, they were raised on what was already there, layer over layer, memory over memory. And the question of what occupies the bottom layer remains, at most major sites, formally unasked. The St. Louis mounds are gone. Whatever the foundation layer contained was hauled away as road fill before anyone thought to ask what it was. But the question it represents is not gone. It is sitting beneath a federal park, beneath an arch, beneath the full weight of a national narrative that has never found it convenient to look down. I don't have the answer. I want to be honest about that. I've been sitting with this specific thread for a long time and it has not resolved. It has only widened. The further I go into the Mississippian record, into the cartographic traditions that surrounded it, into the specific timing of the erasure and the specific character of what replaced it, the more I find not answers but structure, the outline of something deliberately made hard to see, not invisible. Hard to see. There is a difference. The difference matters. 26 mounds on the St. Louis riverfront recorded in 1819. A letter to Thomas Jefferson that went unanswered. 70 years of documented demolition. A federal monument established in 1935 on that specific ground, dedicated to the memory of expansion, not to the memory of what expansion covered. And a steel arch, 630 feet tall, that frames the western horizon so cleanly that almost no one thinks to turn around and ask what is underneath the ground they are standing on. Once you start asking, you cannot stop. The number is 26, and I don't think you will forget it either. The next video goes somewhere I have been circling for a long time. I think I am ready now. See you there.